Today's video is sponsored by EVE Echoes, and I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with EVE Online, the game which offers incredibly epic stories, all driven by player interactions. The game where players make their own factions and corporations, and participate in a player-driven economy, of course, alongside massive 100-player space battles. Well, EVE Echoes restores the classic EVE Online game experience to mobile devices. It's an immersive space sandbox MMO, just like the original game, where you're free to choose your own development path while dealing with things like combat, mining, pilot experience, ship designs, and more. EVE Echoes will allow you to visit and experience 8,000 plus solar systems, over 100 ship types, and more from the EVE universe, all with high quality graphics and sound effects. Of course, once you're in this universe, you can do everything from focusing on trading to warfare. The decision is up to you. So check out EVE Echoes by using the link down in the description, and let me know what you think down in the comments section. Either way, I'll see you guys online. Thanks to EVE Echoes for sponsoring today's video. There are a lot of things in the Star Wars universe that don't make a lot of sense, especially when held up against real-world standards. However, these nonsense things are often saved by either in-universe lore or consistency, or just by looking cool enough. An example for the first would be space combat. Yeah, it behaves nothing like it should based on real-world physics, but because it's at least consistent and we know it's heavily stylized, it gets a pass. For the latter, we have the AT-AT or the Star Destroyer, both vehicles which are seen as fairly nonsensical even in-universe and could be vastly improved, but because they look so cool, we're willing to give them a pass. The vehicle we'll be talking about today not only makes no sense, but also fails to be saved by either any sort of in-universe explanation or the mythical cool factor, and that is the TIE tank, otherwise known as the TIE crawler or the Century tank. Thankfully, this abomination appeared only in one issue of Dark Empire, and by the way, I'm using footage from the fan-created Dark Empire animation, which I'll link to down in the description, and is almost exactly what it looks like. Basically a TIE fighter model adapted for ground combat, with very little concessions made from the original design to make it in any way practical or cool or whatever else. The Century tank is just another example of the Empire's overt tendency to rely on a few iconic designs as the basis for their entire military. On a basic level, all TIE fighter variants, despite potentially having vastly different purposes, pretty much look the same. They all rigidly follow the central cockpit, or perhaps cockpits, with a series of wings around them, despite the inherent challenges with that design. I refuse to believe, for example, that the TIE Scout benefits in any way from those massive solar panels or from sticking to the basic TIE design with the circular cockpit. I say the same of some of the more expensive TIE models which were supposed to compete against Rebel specialty ships, like the TIE Oppressor. I mean, most of them just end up being way over-designed and not nearly as functional as the competing ships at the end. Well, of course, looking completely ridiculous. It's not just the TIE series, although that is what we'll be focusing on today. We also see, for example, the AT-AT boat, which in the face of all practicality essentially turns the base AT-AT design into a submarine, because, well, why not? I understand the purpose of striving for consistency on the Imperial side. It makes sense to present yourself as a limitless empire with the same designs across the galaxy, and we also see that in the Stormtrooper Corps. And from a corporate design, Pioneer Flight Systems, the corporation creating the TIE fighter and its offshoots, would obviously benefit from sticking around central design principles. Ultimately though, this gives us the Century tank, which is the topic of today's video in case you forgot, which shows us very drastically just how dangerous it can be to require all designs to stick to several key principles, especially when you're moving from a starfighter to a tank. So despite the TIE fighter's many downsides, it does have some advantages. Mainly, it's a very cheap fighter, but it's also fast, maneuverable, and performs very well in the hands of skilled pilots. The TIE tank, however, being a treaded vehicle meant to operate in urban environments, not only does not have these features, but could not employ them even if it wanted to. The TIE tank still somehow manages, however, to take all of the disadvantages of the TIE fighter, even when it doesn't really need to. Let's talk first about the TIE tank's version of the TIE fighter's wings, the massive treads on either side of the sort of fuselage. So, like the fighter's wings, the TIE tank's treads massively impact the driver's field of view. Not only that, but given they contain the drive housing, fuel tanks, and of course the actual wheels, they are massive targets which the TIE tank is not properly equipped to protect against. The TIE tank's main weapons are a forward-facing blaster cannon and a turreted light turbo laser. However, even a turreted weapon with 360 degrees of motion is not going to be very effective fighting an enemy to your flank if a giant wheel is blocking it. I mean, this turret is essentially limited to only firing on enemies directly in front or behind of it. And this limitation isn't necessary because I don't think the advantages of hiding your operator really justify it, especially where the sides themselves are already very vulnerable. I think there's a reason that most modern tanks don't do this. They keep the treads together or whatever propulsion system, then they put the guns at the top of the vehicle where they have a much wider or 360 degree in some cases firing arc. Keep in mind too that the TIE crawler is meant to be used in an urban environment, which often means that enemies will be hiding in buildings or attacking you from alleyways. A very versatile, flexible vehicle is one that should be used in this situation, not one that can literally only fire forward. And the TIE tank does bring pretty decent weaponry to a ground battle, but it's just so limited to only specific encounters where enemies are directly in front of it that it's not practical. And a tank certainly can't turn around or switch targets as easily as like a repulsor lift vehicle, so the treads themselves really offer another disadvantage in that way. Interestingly, the TIE tank's predecessor, the TIE Mauler, has many of the same problems but comes a little closer to fixing them. The operator actually does sit above the wheels, and if they had just put in the turret on the top of the tank or allowed the main body to rotate, it would have been alright. However, they still keep the guns at the bottom of the vehicle where they can only face forward. And I mean, this isn't only disappointing from a firepower perspective, but you're just so dramatically limiting the field of view for your vehicle operators that it's really just baffling. It is true that vehicles in the Star Wars universe do have, computers and sensors which allow operators to see without using their eyes, but if you read Star Wars novels or just listen to the movies really, you still hear talk of visual scanning or pilots actually identifying things with their eyes. So having a vehicle with such a narrow field of view really limits the driver and operator. The one benefit of the TIE tank is explained in the Dark Empire sourcebook. Because it was so similar to TIE fighters, those trained in TIEs could adapt to the tank very easily, and of course it was cheap to make. But the issue is, even if you consider, the economics of producing things or the need to fit with an Imperial military doctrine, there are still changes that you can make that don't have any negatives that would be made within universe by smarter factions, and which would make the tank just more effective. Increase the height of the tank's body and put a turreted gun on top. That's a major one right there. Allow for a wider field of view for the driver as well. Again, there are some Star Wars vehicles that don't do this, but they generally get the pass because they look cool. The TIE tank, the Sentry tank, the TIE crawler, whatever you want to call it, does not unfortunately have that benefit. Like many aspects of Dark Empire, the TIE tank did not see a whole lot of action outside of the series, but maybe that's also because of its numerous design flaws, which we've discussed in today's video. But let me know, am I being too critical of the TIE tank? Not critical enough? Do you like the design of the vehicle, even if not from a practical sense, from an aesthetic sense? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. Until next time though guys, this has been EckhartsLadder. Please be safe and may the Force be with you.